The photograph sits behind glass in the Louisiana State Archives, its edges yellowed and cracked with age. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a formal portrait from 1848. A well-dressed woman seated at an ornate tea service, her expression calm and composed. The silver teapots gleam even through the sepia tones, and delicate china cups rest on embroidered cloth. Everything about the image speaks of refinement and Southern prosperity during the antebellum era. But Dr. Helen Moreau, a historian specializing in pre-Civil War Louisiana, noticed something that made her breath catch when she examined the photograph more closely one humid afternoon in July. The woman in the image wore elegant jewelry, intricate earrings, and multiple necklaces that suggested wealth and status. Yet there was something in her eyes, a distant quality that didn't match the formal setting. And then Helen saw it, barely visible against the dark fabric of the woman's dress, a small detail that changed everything. The collar of her gown, upon magnification, revealed something that changed everything about this image. It was high and ornate, but closer inspection showed it concealed something else, subtle marks on her neck that suggested restraint rather than fashion. Helen's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the photograph with property records from Baton Rouge's Beauregard Plantation District. The woman wasn't the mistress of the house posing for a commemorative portrait. She was an enslaved woman named Céline, and within 6 months of this photograph being taken, every member of the family she served would be dead under mysterious circumstances that shocked the entire state of Louisiana. Helen had stumbled upon one of the most disturbing and suppressed cases in Baton Rouge history, a story deliberately buried by authorities who feared the implications of what had happened in that grand house along the Mississippi River. The formal pose, the expensive clothing, the tea service, all of it was a carefully constructed lie. This wasn't a portrait of prosperity and Southern grace. It was evidence of something far darker, a moment frozen in time just before everything collapsed. Helen knew she had to uncover the truth behind those calm, distant eyes. What had Céline witnessed in that house? What had driven her to an act so desperate and final that it would result in 5 deaths? And why had this photograph survived when so many records had been destroyed? The Beauregard estate stood along the Mississippi River, just south of downtown Baton Rouge, surrounded by sprawling live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The main house was a testament to wealth accumulated through cotton and sugarcane. White columns rising 3 stories high, wide verandas wrapping around each level, and imported French furniture filling every room. In 1848, it was home to the Beauregard family. Antoine, the patriarch who had built the fortune, his wife Marguerite, known for hosting elaborate dinner parties, and their 3 adult children, Philippe, Etienne, and Isabelle. The household employed dozens of enslaved people who worked the fields and maintained the grand home. Among them was Céline, who had been purchased at a New Orleans auction when she was just 14 years old. Now 28, she had spent half her life in the Beauregard house, rising from field work to a position inside the home where she served as personal attendant to the family. Her intelligence and composure had not gone unnoticed. Marguerite often boasted to her friends about Céline's refined manners and skill with French cuisine, but what the Beauregards saw as docility was actually something far more complex. Céline had learned to read by secretly watching the children's lessons through doorways. She had memorized the layouts of every room, every routine, every vulnerability in the household's daily life. She kept her expression neutral, her voice soft, her movements graceful, all while observing everything with sharp, calculating eyes. Helen discovered property records showing that Céline had been separated from her mother and 2 younger siblings when she was purchased. Letters from neighboring plantations mentioned that the Beauregard household was known for its strictness, though details were carefully omitted from official correspondence. One letter, dated March 1848, mentioned that discipline had been administered to several enslaved people on the estate, though the writer offered no specifics. The photograph itself was unusual for the era. Few enslaved people were ever photographed in such formal settings, and when they were, it was typically as anonymous figures in the background of family portraits. Yet here was Céline, centered in the frame, dressed in fine clothing, seated at a table of luxury. Helen began to suspect this wasn't a portrait meant for display. It was something else entirely. Perhaps documentation of property, or a bizarre attempt by the Beauregards to demonstrate their benevolence to visitors and business associates who questioned the institution of slavery. Whatever the reason, it captured Céline at a pivotal moment, just months before everything would change. Helen's investigation led her deep into the dusty archives of the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, where she discovered fragmented records from November 1848. A brief notation in the coroner's log stopped her cold. 5 deaths at Beauregard Estate, suspected poisoning. Investigation sealed by order of governor. The entry was followed by a series of redacted lines, the ink deliberately blotted to obscurity. Why would a governor personally intervene to suppress details of deaths on a private estate? She requested access to sealed records through a formal petition, arguing historical significance. While waiting for approval, Helen interviewed descendants of families who had lived in the area during that period. Most knew nothing about the case, but an elderly woman named Dorothy Hebert, whose great-great-grandfather had been a doctor in Baton Rouge, remembered stories passed down through her family. Her ancestor had been called to the Beauregard estate one cold November morning and found all 5 family members violently ill. My grandfather said the doctor tried everything, but they died within hours of each other, Dorothy explained, her voice barely above a whisper in her living room filled with antique furniture and family portraits. But here's what always stuck with him. The doctor said the symptoms didn't match any natural illness he'd ever seen. It was too uniform, too deliberate. He suspected poison immediately, but when he tried to report it to authorities, he was told to keep quiet. They threatened his medical license if he spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed. Helen pressed for more details. Dorothy retrieved a leather-bound journal from a locked cabinet. Her ancestor's personal medical diary, never made public. The entries from November 15, 1848 were chilling. The doctor described symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, convulsions. But what disturbed him most was the timing. All 5 family members had fallen ill simultaneously during dinner, suggesting they had all consumed the same poisoned food or drink. The final entry read, "I believe this was deliberate murder, but I am forbidden from pursuing the matter. The authorities fear the implications. That a slave could orchestrate such an act suggests intelligence and planning they do not wish to acknowledge. They prefer to call it an unfortunate tragedy and move on. God forgive us all." Through cross-referencing the medical journal with servant testimonies buried in courthouse records, Helen pieced together what happened on that fatal November evening. The Beauregards had hosted a private family dinner. No guests, no outside staff, just the 5 of them and Céline, who prepared and served the meal. It was unusual for the family to dine alone without entertaining visitors, but Antoine had wanted to discuss private business matters regarding the plantation's finances with his adult children. Céline had served a traditional Creole dinner, gumbo, rice, braised duck, and sweet potato pie for dessert. She moved through the dining room with her characteristic grace, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates while the family discussed crop yields and cotton prices. Witnesses from neighboring estates reported seeing nothing unusual that evening. Lamps glowed in the windows, and the sound of conversation drifted through the warm night air. But something had been added to the food, something carefully measured and deliberately distributed to ensure each family member received a fatal dose. Arsenic was commonly available in 1848, used for rat poison and even in some medicines and cosmetics. A person with access to the household supplies could easily obtain it without raising suspicion. The key was in the preparation, mixing it into rich, strongly flavored dishes where the bitter taste could be masked by spices and sauces. By 10 o'clock that night, the first symptoms appeared. Marguerite complained of stomach pains. Philippe rushed to a basin, violently ill. Within an hour, all 5 were suffering, and by midnight servants were frantically trying to summon the doctor. But the Beauregard estate was isolated, the roads dark and difficult to navigate at night. By the time the doctor arrived at dawn, 3 were already dead. Antoine and Etienne died before noon. Throughout the crisis, Céline remained in the house, tending to the dying family members with the same calm efficiency she had always shown. Several servants later testified that she seemed almost unnaturally composed, showing no panic or distress even as chaos erupted around her. One housemaid remembered Céline standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, watching Antoine take his final breath, her expression completely unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The arrest came swiftly, though not for the reasons one might expect. The local sheriff, accompanied by 4 armed deputies, arrived at the Beauregard estate on the afternoon of November 17th, just 24 hours after the last death. They found Céline in the kitchen, calmly cleaning the cooking vessels and storing away food supplies. She showed no surprise when they placed her in irons, no fear when they informed her she was being charged with 5 counts of murder. What shocked the deputies was her demeanor. She neither confessed nor denied anything. She simply looked at them with those same distant, unreadable eyes captured in the photograph and said nothing. Her silence was more unnerving than any protest of innocence would have been. As they led her away from the estate, other enslaved people watched from windows and doorways, their expressions a mixture of terror and something else the deputies couldn't quite identify. Perhaps respect, perhaps hope. Helen discovered that the evidence against Céline was substantial but circumstantial. She had sole access to the kitchen that evening. She had prepared and served all the food consumed by the family, and a search of her small quarters, a sparse room in the servants' wing, revealed a hidden tin containing white powder later confirmed to be arsenic. The case seemed straightforward. An enslaved woman had murdered her owners, but the trial records told a different story. Helen found fragments of testimony that had been heavily edited and partially destroyed, but enough remained to reconstruct what happened in that courthouse. Céline was not given a proper defense attorney. Enslaved people had no such rights under Louisiana law. The proceedings lasted less than 3 hours. Witnesses were called to establish her access and opportunity, but no one was allowed to question her motive or testify about conditions on the Beauregard estate. One detail stood out in the surviving records. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Céline finally spoke. Her words were recorded by the court clerk, but later struck from the official record. Helen found them in a private letter written by the clerk to his brother. She looked directly at the judge and said, "I only regret that I could not save the others." When pressed to explain what she meant, she fell silent again and never spoke another word. What others was she referring to? The implication was chilling. Helen's breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the diary of Isabel Beauregard, the youngest of the 3 adult children who had died that night. The diary had been preserved by a cousin who inherited it after the estate was liquidated, and it eventually made its way to a private collector. Helen tracked it down through genealogical records and convinced the current owner to let her examine it. What she found inside shattered the simple narrative of revenge. Isabel's entries from 1847 and 1848 revealed a household far darker than official records suggested. She wrote about her father's increasingly violent temper, her mother's complicity and cruelty, and her brother's casual brutality toward the enslaved people on the estate. But the most disturbing entries concerned Céline specifically. In March 1848, the same month mentioned in that neighboring plantation's letter about discipline, Isabel wrote about an incident in the quarters. "Father discovered that Céline has been teaching the field hands to read," Isabel wrote in a shaking hand. "He was furious beyond measure. He had her whipped in front of everyone as a warning, 20 lashes. Filippo said it was too lenient, that she should have been sold away as punishment, but father insisted she was too valuable to the household. Mother agreed. She said Céline's cooking and service made us the envy of the parish. So they kept her, but made her watch as they sold away 3 other slaves who had learned their letters. One of them was just a child, no more than 12 years old." The entry continued: "I wanted to speak up, to say it was wrong, but I remained silent like always. I am as guilty as the rest of them. Céline's eyes when they led those 3 away, I will never forget that look. It was not anger or sadness. It was something colder, more determined. It frightened me." Helen discovered more through cross-referencing auction records. The 3 people sold away that March included a woman named Marie and 2 children, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Josephine. Property records indicated they had been Céline's mother and younger siblings. The Beauregards had deliberately separated Céline's family as punishment for her crime of literacy. This explained Céline's cryptic statement at trial: "I only regret that I could not save the others." She wasn't referring to other victims. She was referring to her family, already sold and scattered across Louisiana, beyond her reach or protection. The photograph itself became a crucial piece of evidence in Helen's investigation, but not in the way she initially expected. She sent high-resolution scans to a colleague who specialized in 19th century photography, asking him to analyze every detail of the image. His findings were remarkable and deeply disturbing. The photograph had been taken in August 1848, just 3 months before the poisoning, but it wasn't commissioned by the Beauregards as Helen had first assumed. It was commissioned by a New Orleans businessman named Charles Dumont, who dealt in the buying and selling of enslaved people. Letters between Dumont and Antoine Beauregard revealed the true purpose of the portrait. Céline was being advertised for sale to wealthy households, seeking refined house servants with genteel manners and culinary expertise. The elegant clothing, the tea service, the jewelry. All of it was staging, props to display Céline as a luxury commodity. The Beauregards had decided to sell her despite Marguerite's earlier protests about losing such a valuable servant. Financial records showed the plantation was struggling with debt, and selling Céline would bring a premium price, as much as $2,000, an enormous sum in 1848. But there was another layer Helen uncovered through Dumont's business records. He specialized in selling enslaved people to clients in the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, regions known for particularly brutal conditions on cotton plantations. Céline wasn't being sold to another refined household in Louisiana. She was being sent to backbreaking field labor, a death sentence for someone who had spent 14 years working indoors. The photograph was taken in mid-August. The sale was scheduled for December. Céline had approximately 4 months to act before she would be taken away forever, sent to a fate that would almost certainly kill her within a few years. The poisoning occurred in mid-November, just weeks before she was to be sold. Helen studied the photograph again with this new knowledge. Céline's calm expression took on new meaning. It wasn't docility or acceptance. It was the face of someone who had already made a decision, someone who was simply waiting for the right moment. She sat at that table, surrounded by symbols of wealth built on her suffering, wearing borrowed finery, posing for a photograph that would advertise her as property to the highest bidder, and she looked directly into the camera with eyes that revealed nothing of the plan already forming in her mind. Helen's research revealed why the case had been so thoroughly suppressed by Louisiana authorities. The governor who ordered the investigation sealed, Henry Johnson, had personal and financial ties to the Beauregard family and owned 3 plantations himself. But his concern went beyond protecting friends. He was terrified of the precedent this case might set. The 1840s saw increasing tensions over slavery throughout the South. Slave rebellions, though rare, haunted the nightmares of plantation owners. The Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 remained fresh in collective memory. Any case that demonstrated the ability of enslaved people to successfully plan and execute such a calculated act of resistance was considered dangerous propaganda that could inspire others. The authorities wanted the story buried completely. Court records showed that Céline was convicted and sentenced to hanging within a week of her arrest. But Helen discovered something extraordinary in the execution records, or rather, in their absence. There was no record of the execution ever being carried out. The courthouse records simply stopped mentioning Céline after her sentencing. It was as if she had disappeared entirely from official documentation. Helen spent weeks tracking down every possible lead. She searched death records, prison transfer documents, and parish archives. Finally, she found a clue in the personal correspondence of a Catholic priest named Father Michel, who had provided spiritual counsel to condemned prisoners in Baton Rouge. In a letter to his brother dated January 1849, Father Michel wrote cryptically about a woman of remarkable courage, who was spared the rope but condemned to something perhaps worse, to be forgotten entirely. Following this lead, Helen discovered that several prominent Louisiana families had pressured the governor to avoid a public execution. They feared it would create a martyr and bring too much attention to the case. Instead, Celine was quietly transported to a remote work camp in the western part of the state, her name erased from records, her fate deliberately obscured. She would spend the rest of her life in brutal labor, her story suppressed, her act of resistance transformed into a shameful secret that Louisiana's elite wanted buried forever. The Beauregard estate was sold within months, the grand house eventually torn down. The family name faded from prominence, and Celine became a ghost, mentioned only in whispered conversations, her photograph hidden away in archives, her story deliberately forgotten. As Helen prepared to publish her findings, she made one final discovery that connected Celine's story to the present day. Through genealogical research and DNA analysis offered by descendants of enslaved people from Louisiana, she traced possible relatives of Celine who were alive today. The search led her to a woman named Lorraine Dumas, a 68-year-old librarian in New Orleans whose grandmother had passed down stories of an ancestor named Celine who had struck a blow for all of us who couldn't fight back. When Helen showed Lorraine the photograph, the older woman's eyes filled with tears. "That's her," Lorraine whispered, touching the glass that protected the image. "I never thought I'd see her face. We always knew the story, but we never had proof. My grandmother said Celine survived the work camp, though just barely. She lived until 1871, freed by the war, but broken in body. She never spoke about what happened at the Beauregard house, but she told her daughter, my great-great-grandmother, to never forget that she had fought back, that she had refused to be sold away like cattle." Lorraine revealed family documents that confirmed the connection. Letters written after the Civil War, a Bible with Celine's name inscribed inside, and a small tin box containing herbs and spices, a reminder of the kitchen where Celine had exercised the only power she had available to her. The family had preserved these items for generations, waiting for a time when Celine's story could be told without fear of retribution. Helen's article, published in the Journal of Southern History, caused immediate controversy. Some historians praised her meticulous research and argued that Celine's story represented an important example of resistance within slavery. Others condemned the work, arguing that it glorified murder and could be misunderstood as endorsing violence. The debate raged in academic journals and public forums. But for Lorraine and other descendants, the controversy missed the point entirely. People want to make it simple, Lorraine explained during a public lecture at Louisiana State University. They want Celine to be either a monster or a hero. She was a human being pushed beyond endurance who made a choice in impossible circumstances. She knew she would die or worse for what she did, but she did it anyway. That's not about heroism or villainy. It's about what it means to be human when everything human has been stripped away from you. All that the photograph now hangs in a special exhibit at the Louisiana State Museum, part of a comprehensive display about resistance and survival during slavery. Visitors stand before it every day, studying Celine's face, trying to read the emotions behind those distant eyes. The museum includes the full context: the Beauregard family's cruelty, the separation of Celine's family, the plan to sell her away, and her decision to act. It also includes Isabel's diary entries and the medical records that document what happened that November night. Helen continues her research, knowing there are thousands of similar stories still buried in archives across the South, stories of resistance, survival, and humanity, persisting in the face of unimaginable cruelty. She receives letters regularly from people whose ancestors were enslaved, thanking her for bringing Celine's story to light, for refusing to let her be forgotten. On the anniversary of the poisoning, Lorraine and other descendants gather at the site where the Beauregard estate once stood. Nothing remains of the grand house with its white columns and elegant verandas. The land has been developed into a residential neighborhood, where modern homes sit on streets named after trees rather than the plantation owners who once dominated this land. But the descendants remember. They bring flowers, they speak Celine's name aloud, and they tell her story to their children. The photograph that was meant to commodify Celine, to reduce her to property that could be bought and sold, has become instead a testament to her humanity and her resistance. Every person who looks at that image and sees not a docile servant, but a woman planning her survival, planning to strike back against a system designed to crush her, that's Celine's victory. She could not save her mother and siblings. She could not prevent her own suffering, but she refused to go silently to the fate others had planned for her. Helen reflects on this as she updates her research files, preparing for her next project. History is full of photographs that hide secrets, documents that obscure truth, and official records that serve power rather than justice. But somewhere in the archives, in the private letters and personal diaries, in the memories passed down through families, the real stories survive. They wait to be discovered, to be spoken aloud, to reclaim their place in our understanding of the past. Celine's photograph is not just evidence of a crime or a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that behind every sanitized narrative of the past, behind every grand estate and elegant portrait, there were human beings whose stories we must not forget. The photograph looks sweet, a refined woman at a tea service, but it speaks of resistance, survival, and the terrible choices people make when pushed beyond endurance. And now, finally, we are listening.